Archana, less than 10% of women are part of the formal workforce from close to 20% early in the decade. Why is this figure so low now?
Actually, if we see how this figure has dropped even from the early 90s, when we had an almost 30% women's participation when India started its liberalization process, to where we are now, we're less than, we're in one-digit figures. It's because the pandemic did hit Indian women harder. So we already had a trend of falling women's participation in the workforce. And then as we spoke to, for instance, the research by economists like Rosa Ibrahim, who's a professor at Azim Premji University, and CMI economists in Bombay show us that basically during the lockdown, women lost their jobs and they were several times more likely to lose jobs, and they didn't have fallback options. So they couldn't really rejoin the workforce. And given that India's informal economy is almost 90% of the economy, the opportunity for formal jobs has fallen even further. And this is why we're in this dire situation at the moment.
So the pandemic is one thing, Archana, but women's workforce participation had been falling even before the pandemic. So what actually happened in the past decade, and why so few women in the workforce?
So this is a story that we have been tracking for the last 4 or 5 years consistently. Bloomberg has been doing stories on this phenomenon for the last few years. And what we have been seeing, what economists tell us and policymakers tell us, is that one of the factors has been, unfortunately, India's becoming wealthier itself, because once families became more wealthy, they had more money. The decision generally was that the women will stay back at home. And this is because of the way the society looks at women, and women's participation in economic activity is not really seen as an important, is not seen as important. Men typically get more preference in their homes, and that reflects in the workplace. So we've been seeing that over the past 1 decade, as India started getting wealthier, women started staying at home, in more families. And as far as the women who were joining the workforce, they were joining the informal workforce. So the formal economy also was shrinking at the same time. We know that India went into a recession last 2 years. Even before the pandemic, India had gone into a recession. So that actually hit women harder than it hit men. And that is why we've been seeing this consistent fall in the women's participation in the workforce.
Tell me, Archana, the economic and societal stakes, but perhaps the former, the stakes are really high here. And is the government addressing this in any way at the moment? How is it doing so?
There are two parts to this. One is that seemingly, if we look at the policies and the announcements that the government has made, for instance, there is a very high-profile campaign called the Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, or Save Our Daughter and Teach Our Daughters, that the Modi government launched, and they've been consistently pushing this agenda. But it's sad that India has to do this 75 years since it got its independence, and we're still talking about saving daughters and teaching them instead of pushing them out in the workforce. But that is basically the level at which a big part of the country is in. And so that is one part. And the second part is that, yes, there have been attempts by the policymakers, but it has been more in terms of, instead of creating jobs, it's about creating economic opportunities. So there have been more, for instance, women who've been taking loans from the government for small and medium scale industries. So we know that Mudra loans, which this government launched, they've been bigger beneficiaries of this. Having said that, when it comes to expanding the formal economy, that itself is not really visible on the ground. We're now seeing the country step out again after a long pandemic and the hit that the economy took from the pandemic. So now we need to see whether the government actually does take this into account and take these numbers seriously.